Joining us this evening for Stark Library's event with Barbara Lyons. So this evening's presentation is, we'll get started here in a few minutes, The Secret of Quilts. And I'd like to introduce Barbara Lyons. And before I do that, I'd like to let everyone know about some other events that we have coming up at Stark Library. I invite you to visit our website at starklibrary.org. Actually, this evening we have a cooking program on Facebook, so we're happy to have you join. And also we have a variety of technology classes. We have story time for preschoolers. So visit starklibrary.org and please take a look at all of the fun and exciting programs that we have coming up. All right, so now I'd like to introduce Barbara Lyons. We're happy to have her tonight. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you.
Barbara is a graduate of the University of California, San Diego with a BA degree in music and has earned a master's degree in ethnomusicology from Bethel University in St. Paul, Minnesota. Barbara is also an author, and she was taught by her mother at a young age how to be proficient with a needle and thread. Her thirst for knowledge started with a desire to make doll clothes, and it soon progressed into making her own clothes, then her family's clothes, and finally evolved into a bona fide addiction to all things fiber. She sews, knits, spins, quilts, and even makes her own soaps and personal care products. Mrs. Lyons is a wife, mother, and grandmother of two. She is also a proud recipient of the University of Mount Union 2010 Martin Luther King Jr. Leadership and Diversity Award. So with that, I will turn it over to Barbara. Welcome. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure to be here. And today, we're going to talk about code language through quilts. And if I could get my next screen, next. Thank you so much. Next. One of the first things I want you to understand is that Africans were artists. They were workers, weavers, poets, teachers, mathematicians, and priests. We get this idea, false notion, that the enslaved actually had no skills, no understanding, and no learning. And I want you to understand from the very beginning that they did. Next screen. Africans had secret societies. Think of them as sororities and fraternities, rites of passage. They had universities. All of our learning tends to start from the Greeks and the Romans, but I ask you the question, well, where did the Greeks and Romans get all their knowledge from? From the African continent. That's where. Next screen. We asked the question, how did the enslaved quilt in code? That's a great question. So let's dive in. Next screen. I'm going to talk to you tonight specifically about a story from this book, Hidden in Plain View, which is the secret story of quilts and the Underground Railroad. It's a story of Ozella McDaniels Williams. This is her family's oral history in terms of how they utilized code language through quilts. Next, please. First thing, we need some fundamentals. Next. Some of you may or may not understand what a quilt is. Yes, it's a blanket. Yes, it's covering, but it's made. A quilt is nothing more than 3 layers of cloth sewn or tied in some way to prevent the batting, that's the layer in between, from shifting. Traditionally, that inner layer was cotton that provided warmth. The enslaved had to use old clothes or rags as their batting, or they were able to glean the fields and create their own. Now, if you've ever gleaned a field, then you know they didn't have a whole lot. So they used what they had. Quilts are held together with stitches. And fine running stitches is what you normally find in a quilt. It was thought that the enslaved weren't sophisticated enough to do fine work. And if you see by the picture below, this is another representation of a quilt that was owned by a family that shows you very fine running stitches amidst the design, but in this stitch work, there is the outline of topography. Next, please. There's also tack quilts or tack stitches, where you will stitch in place and then scoot over a little bit and stitch in place again. Many tack quilts are knotted. Now, the slave owners and their mistresses considered tack quilts to be crude and not as sophisticated, but they did not understand that the knots had meaning, and each knot was tacked about 2 inches apart, and this made a grid. And with every map is gridded. So if you'll think of it like this, for those 2 inches from one tack to the other tack, it was thought to be about 5 miles. You know how you have on a map, you have the legend that tells you how many inches equals what? Well, in tack quilting, from one square to the next square was approximately 5 miles. Next screen. 5 knots, and this would be a knot, a little bit of thread, another knot, a little bit of thread, another knot. 5 knots on a quilt came from the African notion of watch care. What is watch care? In the African American church, there are many ways by one can become a member of the church. You can join by Christian faith and profession. You can join by letter. You can also join by what's called watch care. Watch care means you have a church back home somewhere and you're only here temporarily, but you want to hook in and be in a community so that watch over your soul. They care for you. They become that home away from home. And the 10th quilt that we're going to be just talking about today always had the 5 notches on each tack. And that meant when a slave would see the quilt with the 5th knot of the 11 pattern, it was time to pack up and get ready to go. You were going to be freight for the Underground Railroad. Next screen. Quilts were displayed, but they weren't displayed willy-nilly. And if you'll see in the picture, some of the quilts are hanging out of a window, some are hanging on a fence. Well, the enslaved had to be creative in terms of how to get messages across. And please understand that everybody wasn't initiated into understanding the code language. Only those that were deemed to be trustworthy could be initiated in understanding what the pattern meant. So if you're trying to get a message out, you're going to have to do it in such a way that it doesn't hold suspicion, either from the master or the overseer. And each square or sampler or even whole quilt was displayed at a proper time to educate the initiate. And each pattern had a meaning. Now you may ask yourself, why display it? How can I display this in such a way where it doesn't create suspicion? Back in the day, there were no Pampers. So when you wrapped your baby up, you knew accidents were going to happen. So you always had to air the quilt out. Washing the quilt was not going to happen on a weekly basis. You might have done it maybe once a month. So you hung it out to dry. Everybody did this, master, overseer alike. So it was nothing to be to see a quilt being aired out. There was no reason to be suspicious. Next, please. The first wrench is the monkey wrench, this first pattern. Next. The monkey wrench was a sign for preparation. It meant to gather tools for the journey, but not in a way where you're packing up the U-Haul. You were only supposed to gather what you needed for the journey. It was also a symbol for a person who was considered wise or knowledgeable. Now, here's what you need to understand. For the enslaved, believe it or not, they never saw the whole plantation. They only knew the parts that they were required to work in or the places where they were allowed to be. There were usually only two people who had full access to the plantation, and that was the blacksmith or the driver of the master. They were considered the knowledgeable ones because they were exposed to the outside world and could bring information back to the community. Next. The second quilt pattern you'll see is either the wagon wheel or carpenter's wheel, and you can see that it was either a block pattern or actual round pattern. Next. This was a sign to take only what could fit in a wagon or only what you could comfortably carry. I don't know if you've ever seen the old-fashioned Conestoga or buck wagons, but they're narrow and you could only get about 2 adults side by side with a false bottom and a top. If you were riding underneath it, you barely had enough space between your nose and that bottom of the wagon. So you couldn't be loaded down with something bulky, something that could bump, something that could make noise. Next. The bear's paw. This is a beautiful pattern. Next. The bear's paw meant to look for bear tracks. Why? Because the bears knew the wilderness. They knew where water was, they knew where food was, and only foolish men would go over the mountain. The bear knew how to go around the mountain. So you look for bear tracks and you look for bear scat and you prayed mightily that you didn't find the bear. But if you would pay attention to these things, it would help you in your quest towards freedom. Next. Crossroads. Next. The crossroads were assigned to look for the city of Cleveland, of all things. Cleveland was also known as the city of hope on the Underground Railroad. It is also an African symbol of intersection between the living and the ancestors. Now, a lot of times in musical sense, when you hear about the crossroads, you heard about the man who wanted to fiddle and sold his soul to the devil, and he met him at the crossroads. Well, the crossroads are also that intersection of the living and the dead because the ancestors watched over you. That's where your watch care comes from. So if you were relying on the ancestors to see a symbol as such, you already knew, this is what I must do. I must reach out to my ancestors so they will watch over me. If any of you have seen the movie Amistad, one of the best scenes in my mind was where Zeke was with the former president Adams, and they were fighting for his case. And Adams says, oh, we have might on our side, we have right on our side. And Zeke says, I will pray to my ancestors, and they will come. And Adams kind of scoffed at him, thinking, ugh, you primitive people. He says, what makes you think that they'll come and answer your prayer? He says, because I am the sole reason they existed. They must come. And such was the faith of the enslaved when they could see that sign. Next square. The log cabin. Next. The log cabin believed it was a sign of recognition. Now, the center traditionally holds a red or a fiery square because it represented the hearth. Even today, everything kicks off at the kitchen. Kids come home from school, where's the first place they go? Kitchen, right? Everybody wants to meet. Everybody tells about their day and discusses in the kitchen. But for this particular quilt, the center was black or a dark blue, and it meant safe house. One of the things we need to understand is that Indigo dyed black fabrics were expensive fabrics. The average person couldn't necessarily afford it, not even in terms of scrap. So if you are the enslaved and you are out on the road and you see one of these quilts either hanging on a fence or on a limb, and you see that dark square, that tells you not only is it a safe house, but these people can afford to feed you, let alone shelter you. And so that brought great hope to the enslaved as they were running. Next. Shoe fly kind of looks like the monkey wrench turned inside out. Next. Shoe fly is believed to refer to an actual person who aided runaways, or he was a conductor or an aide on the railroad. It's possible that they were in a fraternity, possible that they were Masons, most likely they were abolitionists, or just simply believed that such persons needed assistance. And therefore, when you saw the shoe fly, you knew you were going to be looking for someone who was sympathetic to your plight and your cause. Next. The bow tie, also known as the hourglass. Next. This was a sign to change clothes, to dress formally, and to blend in a crowd. Now, dressing formally didn't mean these great big antebellum hoops. It meant to dress in your station. You did not want to call attention to yourself, and you were reliant upon the shoe fly to provide you with clothing so you could blend into a crowd. Now think for a minute, if you were coming from the deep south and you're trying to escape north, and even if you make it into Ohio, which was a free state, you would look like something from the Crypt Keeper, because it was going to take you a good 6 weeks to 6 months, depending on how your route was going, the time of the year that you decided to escape. You were going to be a frightful sight, and anybody who had a lick of sense would be able to figure out you were a runaway. So you were dependent upon that shoe fly to provide for you clothing where you could blend in. All likelihood, you were going to be a servant of some sort, or you were going to be a laborer of some sort, but you were going to be decent. Your clothes were not going to be ragged. You were going to be well kept, but within your station. Next. Flying geese. Next. The geese helped runaways find north, and the quilts displaying that pattern would also help runaways find the true direction of north. Now, we hear the song all the time, you know, follow the drinking gourd or follow the North Star. How many of you have actually looked for the North Star in the skies of late? That star is dim, even on a moonless night. So if you are in the brush or if you are in the forest, you're not going to always be able to find the North Star. And you're like, okay, so what do you mean by the flying geese helping you to find north? Think for a minute. I know we have quite a few quilters with us tonight. Imagine if in your pattern, all of your geese are blues or greens, but you have one odd duck that's yellow or red, and only one. There's your direction. So if your odd duck, however it is being displayed, is pointing in the direction of north, it gives somebody who is on the road an idea of which way to go. Next. Drunkard's path. Next. The drunkard's path is unique. It warned runaways to travel in a zigzag pattern. Think of it like a fox. When a fox is running from its pursuer, it's never going to run in a straight line. It runs all over the place, right? Next. Africans believed, and not just Africans, but other ethnicities too, believe that evil can run in a straight line. So you never want to give evil a chance to catch you. You want to confuse the demon. You want to confuse those spirits in such a way. You want to stagger like you're drunk. And you may have to backtrack a while so that you can throw whatever that's chasing you off the scent. Next. The North Star, or the evening star, the star pattern. This is quite common, and everyone loves the North Star pattern. Next. This instructed you to look for the North Star because it's the one star that's constant. It never moves in the sky, or at least that's what they believed. Now, for years I used to wonder, how is it we live in a universe that is always in motion? How is it this star never moves? How is it that it always stays in the same place? Well, the reason for that is because the North Star is stationed right on top of the Earth's axis. In the south, or in the southern hemisphere, it's the Southern Cross. But since we're in the northern hemisphere, it's the North Star. So it seems like it never moves, but we all know that everything is in motion, but it stays constant enough where we could follow it, or the enslaved, the escapees could follow. Next. Tumbling blocks. Next. This quilt sign was used to tell the slaves to get ready to leave, to pack it up. Now, this is not saying we're going to get our boxes from U-Haul, but it does say that whatever you have collected, whatever can fit on your person, whatever can fit in a small satchel or even a small quilt like the old hobos used to take on their poles, whatever it is, pack it up. We're getting ready to leave. Next. This was a chart showing how some patterns and some African patterns coalesce. On the far left, you see the African symbols. In the middle, the American quilt patterns. And on the far right, Masonic emblems. So this is not a hard stretch for the enslaved, even though they may not necessarily be educated as we believe education is. They could see things and put the pieces together in spite of not having Velcro. Next. These patterns, once again, as you can see, for the African symbol, we've got broken dishes, and we've got the bow tie, we've got the flying geese. We have all of that wonderful stuff, and it mimics the American quilt patterns as well. Next. It was widely believed by the slaveholders that slaves themselves could not quilt with geometric patterns. Why? Because it called for exacting measurements. Now remember, the enslaved were educated people within their fields and in their crafts. Because they could not speak the captor's language did not make them ignorant. It simply made them incapable. But once they learned how to speak the language, they could communicate. They understood geometry because many were mathematicians. This was a walk in the park for them. And even my own great-grandmother, bless her heart, she didn't have templates, but could do this type of quilting. She just had a ruler and a piece of paper and a pencil and could sketch it out. Next. Ozella's secondary code patterns, you will see one for the sailboat, breeches, basket, traditional 9-patch. In her oral history, these two were used to carry the message towards freedom for the enslaved. Next. The rose wreath For a long time, it was believed that the enslaved did not do applique work on their quilts. But after doing a little more reading and a little more research, I found there were certain plantations, especially in Texas, where those persons who were enslaved who were quilting, and many were not just quilting for themselves, but they were quilting for the gentry and the master, they did do applique work, and they often were given prizes for how well they could do. So if you ever hear that, oh, slaves didn't do that, yes, they did. Next. It's believed that samplers were used to teach the enslaved the codes. Why? Because idle hands make the devil's workshop. So consequently, each generation taught the next. The elders taught the youngers, and the tweenies taught the babies. Everyone had to be industrious at some point in time. And you can't expect a child to understand how to use a needle and thread on a full quilt. It just doesn't work. Their hands aren't nimble enough in that way. So samplers were used, and everybody would be working on the same block at the same time. Also, we know for some of our primary narrative readings that many slaves were proficient, or what we would call professional seamstresses and tailors by the age of 13. It was not uncommon. So to teach younger generations, or to babysit, because if you were too old to work in the field or you were too old to work in the house, you were babysitting little people, and little people always had to have some kind of work to do. They simply weren't allowed to play and be children, especially the girls. So masters and overseers were a little more less suspicious if they saw hands of industry. Next, quilts are precious objects. Not only were they for warmth and comfort, but they were used as housewarming and wedding gifts. They were also used as burial shrouds. One of the interesting things about this particular book is that many historians poo-poo the oral tradition. And I hasten to say that all history is oral tradition. I'm going to go one step further, and I'm going to offend some folks egregiously, so hold on. We call it history instead of her story, because around the campfire, he kept telling these stories and wouldn't get the details right. And the wife was, oh my goodness, I would to God that you get this story straight. Write this stuff down. So that's why it became his story, not her story. So the need for empirical evidence to prove that a story is true. We'd be in sad shape, would we not, if we didn't believe our oral histories. The Bible itself is an oral history that someone finally decided to write down. And now we take it as, say it with me, gospel, right? Because it went from the voice to pen and paper. So there are many people who want empirical evidence that slaves actually quilted in this way and produced these quilts. Because there is no empirical evidence, they want to poo-poo it and say it never really happened, that this is a wonderful fictional story. I would say to you that there is empirical evidence, but you just aren't privy to it. Those families that are deeply tied to the South, that still have means, that still have land, that still have heirlooms, many of them still have these quilts, but they're not willing to bring them out in the open or the public because they don't want them damaged, they don't want the light damage, and they simply don't want to share that. But I also submit to you that we know for a fact quilts were used as burial shrouds. During the Civil War, do you know that every piece of fabric and cotton got used before the end of the war? There was no fabric to be had due to the blockades, and cotton couldn't be shipped out to England where it was turned into fabric and thread and whatnot and then shipped back to us. So with that said, you have all of these battles that are taking place, and the numbers are ridiculous. How are you burying these people? We know for a fact that there were many aid societies in the South that if they were not knitting gauze for bandages, they were quilting small cot-type quilts that their soldiers would use in their pack, and they would take with them, using them as cover and using them as ground cover by which to sleep on. Often, there were no morticians around. Oh, excuse me. Coffins were hard to come by. So evidently, these bodies were buried in their quilts. Now, this is the Deep South. It's hot as 40 hells. There was no embalming back in the day, and you had to get them in the ground quickly. So consequently, that fabric was going to decay along with the bodies. That's where your empirical evidence is. It's in the grave. Next. I realize we went through this rather quickly because I wanted to give enough time for folks to ask questions, but I encourage you to become a flag bearer. And when I say learn our stories, I'm talking about us as a people in the United States. Learn your stories. Remember your stories. Pass your stories along so that your children understand your stories. And if you are a quilter, quilt your stories. Have something that the generations can come back to, where they can ask questions, where they can have a piece of you and a piece of your history. That's extremely important, even today, as we are dealing with COVID and being cooped in and having to learn each other all over again. What a wonderful gift to give to your children, your grandchildren. What a wonderful legacy if you can put into cloth your story. I know for a fact that we have Katrina quilts that are out. I don't know if any of you have heard of them, but Katrina quilts are remnants of things that were found after the storm that were put into a quilt so that people could piece back together their lives before catastrophe hit. I want to impress upon you, don't wait for catastrophe. Piece together your lives now. Leave something now so that your family can remember you by. I see we have some questions. Mariana, can you help? You're muted, Mariana.
I'm sorry, thank you.
That's quite all right.
So yes, if you have questions, you can go ahead and use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Just go ahead and click on there and type your question, and we can get started with a few of them here. So we have a question. Was there always just one special pattern per quilt?
No, I do not believe so. And according to the book, sampler quilts themselves were produced. So you may have had a range of the patterns that we're seeing or that were shown that were in one quilt. And then again, there were quilts that were simply one pattern. Frederick Douglass was given a quilt of the monkey wrench pattern, and that's all it was in the entire quilt, because The community looked to him as being one of the supreme leaders and men of intelligence. So he was gifted this quilt, and to the day he died, it was on his bed.
All right. We did have a question about having a little more time with the picture patterns. So someone enjoyed, and sorry if the presentation went a little too fast, but someone did make a comment about that. Always, we have a comment that said, wow, great presentation and thank you.
You're welcome.
And let me see what else we have here. Can you comment on the Geese Bend quilt?
Geese Bend.
Geese Bend.
Geese Bend is a community in Mississippi where many, I guess people would call it primitive. I bristle at that. Very artistic. Many of these women were taking old clothes, scraps, feed sacks, anything they could get their hands on, and they were creating a quilt of comfort to keep the family warm. Geese Bend is an economically depressed community even to this day. Has anyone gone online? Etsy's now selling Geese Bend quilts. Has anyone seen the price that they are commanding? Yeah, I told my mother, I said, ooh, girl, you're gonna have to raise your prices because these are incredible. One was starting at $5,000 and it was only 2 colors, not a myriad of things. I cannot comment on the artistic evaluation of it, but these women, for many, this is the only craft they have. This is all they know. This is how they're trying to put food on the table for their family, but yet at the same time, they are passing that craft along to the younger generation. They're making them see how quilts are made, how much time it takes, how much love is invested. And I know my mother creates quilts very much in the same vein. And she would say, you know, I just don't have an eye for color, which is a lie. She does. But for her, it's all about functionality, as were Geese Bend. It was all about functionality, and someone was actually able to see the art in it. I hope that helped you and answered your question.
All right, thank you. So we have another question about where can any of these quilts be seen in person?
I don't think you're going to see them in person. As I said earlier, for those individuals and families that actually have quilts from the Civil War era, they're not bringing them out. They don't even want you to know they have them. You might find one in a museum here or there, but they don't bring it out very often because they're afraid of light damage. So,
okay. So we have another question about, it says historians do not always agree on the use of quilts to help slaves. Can you share your thoughts about this and how we know the quilts were used in this manner?
The only way that we know that the quilts were used in this manner is that this was Ozella's story, and she passed it along to Dr. Dobert before she died. Her family wasn't interested in the story. You know, that tends to be the way with younger folks because they look at old-timey, old-fashioned things. You know, it's the modern age, so we have to get with it. Historians, bless their hearts, they don't know everything. They think they do, especially if they're men, they think they do. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't happen. They can't disprove that it didn't happen. And case in point, all my life, I grew up hearing the story that Thomas Jefferson fathered children with his slave, Sally Heming. How long have we heard that's not true, that's not right? He was the founder and architect of the Constitution and the preamble and blah, 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 blah. Okay, years later, what now? Yes, he did indeed. And so just because you didn't like it, you didn't want it, you don't see it, it doesn't make sense to you, doesn't mean it didn't happen. And that's how I feel with certain historians. They don't want to deal with the oral tradition because they feel that it is not reliable and they're looking for empirical evidence. You may not always get your empirical evidence. Or dig it up, find the scraps and remnants that way, but that still doesn't mean you get the whole story. I think there's something to be said about the oral tradition. Every ethnicity has an oral tradition. There is truth in every oral tradition, whether you choose to believe it or not. So now it all washes out in terms of, what do you believe? What strikes you as being truth? If you don't believe it, then nothing I say is going to make you believe it. That's where I stand.
Okay, thank you. There was a comment that the Cleveland Art at one time did an exhibit on these quilts, and it was incredible. And there's several great presentations and thank yous. And then another question about, do you have a suggestion of where I can learn to start quilting?
Yes. The first thing I would recommend, wherever you are, whatever community you are, look for a quilting guild in your community. Many of them have online presences or Facebook presences. You can always go to quilt stores, especially those that are specifically geared towards quilting. You can always go to Joanne if you're in a pinch, and they may be able to help you. But I would just put feelers out. Go to your library. Ask the librarian. There are many quilting guilds that meet in libraries where you can get the hookup and learn how to start. I would also say, start simply. Don't that you're making, these intricate quilts the first time out. Do a simple patch quilt or a patchwork quilt. Learn and hone the craft. It may not be for you. You may get into it and realize, you know what? I am tired of sticking myself. I don't like this. That's okay. You gave it a try. But, start simply. Be kind to yourself. Mistakes will be made. You're not going to be perfection out the gate. I promise you, as long as I have been sewing and as long as I have been quilting, I still make mistakes. Only Allah is perfect. In the Arabic world, only God is perfect. And a mistake doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. It's an interpretation. Let's roll with that interpretation. And my last point would be, if you make a mistake, and someone points out the mistake, tell them they need to introduce themselves. They're entirely too close.
Right, so I think we have time for one more. There is a question here about, did any men do quilting?
In the sense, I would say yes, especially younger boys, because they had to learn how to mend their own clothes. So it would only make sense, yes, that they would learn how to do quilting. And we do have men today that quilt, not that many, but yes.
Okay. And then we'll take one more. There's another one here. I think I got to all of them. The name of the book that you were referencing.
The name of the book is Hidden in Plain View. And I would have to go back to my screen to actually look. Dobart is one of the authors. Oh Lord, I don't even have it in front of me. Can we go back? Is it possible? Yes.
There we go.
Hidden in Plain View. And this is by Jacqueline Tobin and J.C. Dobart, PhD. This is a great read. It's an easy read. You could even do it in one night if you were so inclined. It tells a whole lot more than just the quilt squares. It actually talks about how the enslaved were called and referred to as merchandise. so that those that were on the lookout or those that were trying to insert themselves as spies into the Underground Railroad wouldn't be privy necessarily. So if you're a businessman and you're on a trip and you're taking care of merchandise, your merchandise, you wouldn't necessarily know were people. So she talks a lot about this in the book, and I think they did a great job in terms of validating rather what she had to say. Other than the fact that, as she was saying, her family practiced this particular type of code language, we know that there were other code languages that were going on simultaneously. So I bet you dollars to donuts your local library has a copy of this book. And if they don't, they can get an interlibrary loan for you. Do take the time to read it. It is worth it.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Barbara. It was a wonderful presentation. I'd also like to remind everyone also that this Wednesday we have Dr. Leslie Heafy will be joining us for a presentation on the Negro Leagues. So that's Wednesday afternoon at 2 p.m. on Zoom. So you can go to our website and get information about that event as well. All right, so thank you for joining us, and I wish everyone a good evening.